Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Feminist Astrologers Podcast. My name's Carol from the Astrology Parlour, and I'd like to welcome you here today for my very first podcast. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Paramount people who are the traditional custodians of the land here that I'm on today. I would like to acknowledge the elders of the Paramount people, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal people throughout Australia. So, very excited, my very first podcast. I'm an astrologer and a feminist. So the subject matter that I would like to be talking about in these podcasts is obviously astrology, but also anything of a feminist kind of a nature, and anything really of a spiritual kind of a nature too. So, kind of want the podcast to cover a number of things like that, but basically mostly sort of around how that fits in with astrology. So to start with today, I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths. I find the myths very fascinating. I am what is known as a traditional astrologer, so I work with some of the the older kind of stuff, which I love because I find it's really very authentic way of working with astrology. But I also enjoy a lot of the modern techniques as well, and the asteroids, which is a fairly new kind of a phenomenon as far as astrology is concerned, is a really good way into looking at some of the more feminine kind of aspects of the birth chart. So I've been doing a lot of work on that kind of thing at the moment. Main inspiration for a lot of this comes from the wonderful Demetra George, who wrote the book Asteroid Goddesses, and she is without, a doubt the goddess mother, if you like, of the asteroids in astrology. So a lot of my work, or what I'm presenting to you, is inspired by her work. She laid the foundations for so much of this really exciting kind of branch of astrology. So I want to talk a bit about the asteroids, and in particular one asteroid. I've been working on a project which is now launched called the Goddess Project, where it looks at all these feminine type stuff in a bit more detail. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically comes from that project, some of the stuff that we do during the Goddess Project, and I hope that it will be helpful for you today. Now, when I'm looking at these kind of mythologies, what I'm trying to do, particularly because of my, feminist kind of point of view, is break down some of this, these myths. The part I guess that I struggle with a lot when it comes to astrology, because I am a feminist, and because a lot of this astrology stuff was formed during a very patriarchal time, which we still are obviously in a patriarchal time, but it was kind of when there was that real shift from matriarchal to patriarchal, so it was almost like a little bit of a warring kind of going on between the two ways of being. And so a lot of the mythology that we look at kind of reflects what was happening back then, reflects how the political kind of stuff that was going on, of trying to kind of use these myths of the goddesses and kind of convert things over to see things from the god's point of view and kind of diminish the strength of the goddesses and build up the strength of the gods, to kind of turn our whole world, into this very patriarchal kind of structure. So, a lot of the stuff goes back to that kind of stuff. And I am not a historian or, a scholar of mythology or anything like that. I look at these sort of things purely from the point of view of an astrologer and a feminist, and look at things of how, you might be able to sort of pull away some of those layers and get to the roots or the bones of the mythology, what it really what that mythology might look like if it was told from the goddess's perspective, what it might look like if it was told from a woman's perspective. And I find that quite fascinating to do. So a lot of the stuff that I'll say is kind of my opinions or thoughts, or opinions and thoughts that I have heard expressed by other feminists, like Dimitri George and others. So what I would like to talk to you about today is the goddess Athena. I love Athena, and I've always loved Athena, even when I knew very little about Athena. I loved the fact that she was this warrior goddess, I loved the fact that she wasn't, dressed like the other goddesses, but she had, the sword or the spear and the shield and the armor and all the rest, and she was strong and she was powerful. And I guess I was always drawn to that kind of image of goddess. So I do, really love the stories around Athena. But what I noticed, is that she was really used a lot as a bit of a scapegoat, She was really used a lot by the patriarchal system to try and take things over to their side. So if we have a little bit of a look at the story, and I'm going to tell some of the stories from my point of view, and you can make what you like of that. But if we start with her birth, and most of us are aware that Athena sort of, burst out of her father's Zeus's head, and Zeus is another name for Jupiter. So Athena burst out of his head, born with no mother, just a father, as though she was like a thought form, something he'd thought up and created in his mind and then brought manifest into reality. But that's not the whole truth at all. In fact, it's very little of the truth about Athena's origins, because she did have a mother, and her mother's name was Metis. And Metis was a Titan sea goddess, daughter of Oceana. Okay? And Metis was well known to Zeus. She had been an advisor to him, had actually helped him with the potion that he needed in order to rescue his siblings from their father. So he knew her quite well. Now, at this point, I guess I need to put in a bit of a trigger warning. Most people are probably already aware that the Greek and Roman mythology does contain a great deal of violence towards women, and in particular sexual violence. So a bit of a trigger warning in here. While I won't talk in any very graphic details of situations, it is the subject matter of a lot of these mythologies. So let's make that very clear now, so that you're aware of that and can make that choice whether you wish to listen or not. Okay, so continuing with the story, Metis was well known to Zeus, but she had refused his advances. Zeus, being Zeus, wouldn't really take no for an answer, and forced himself upon her, and she became pregnant. Now, Zeus was then given this prophecy that a child born from his union with Metis, and not this particular child, but a child born, a later child, may be his downfall. So he didn't like that idea at all and decided that he needed to rid himself of Metis. Not that easy to rid yourself of an immortal being. She was a goddess, so she was immortal. You can't just, snap your fingers and she's gone. You can't just kill her. So he decided that the best thing to do, of course, was to swallow her down whole. Another option could have been, I guess, just don't ever rape her again, but that would require him restraining himself, and we certainly wouldn't want to do that, would we? So sorry for my sarcasm, but you will get a bit of that from me anyway. He swallows her down whole, and that's it, end of problem as far as he's concerned. Now, sometime later, he's walking along the shores of Lake Triton, and this is a sacred place to Metis. This is her place. And he's walking along these shores, and lo and behold, he gets this headache, this massive headache, unbearable headache. And to relieve that pain, an axe is taken, and it is a double-sided axe. This is a well-known sort of ancient matriarchal symbol, and a lot of feminists use that imagery now as a symbol of feminism. But this double-sided axe was taken to relieve his pain, and out springs Athena, or she's known as Pallas Athena. Pallas Athena springs out of her father's head, fully grown, fully armoured. She's got her spear, she's got her sword, and she lets out a tremendous victory cry. She's won the first part of the battle. She's managed to be born, but she springs out ready for battle again. She doesn't know what to expect. And how would she know what to expect? This is a father that had actually just, swallowed her mother down whole while she was still inside. So, she's ready. But Zeus takes a look at her and goes, you know what? Looks her up and down and thinks to himself, I'm paraphrasing what I'm thinking, but, thinks to himself, here she is, not looking like a usual kind of a goddess. She looks kind of cute, she's got her little mini-me armour on, and he's deciding that, she's quite amusing and that he'll keep her. He won't just swallow her straight down again. And she soon becomes his favourite. Now, first thing I think that's really important to note here is that this whole relationship is based on a level of fear. He swallowed her mother down. He could swallow her down again at any time. So there's fear involved right from the start. So people with a strong Pallas Athena in their birth chart, and this is where we take the astrology back, these stories back to you personally, because remember that that mythology is represented in this asteroid. And if this asteroid is placed somewhere quite strong in your birth chart, then these mythologies are stories that you might relate to in your personal life in one way or another. So people with a strong Pallas Athena, one of the things that they could immediately recognise is this need to kind of please the father. And that need can be based on this, on a little bit of fear, fear of his displeasure, what would happen if he wasn't pleased with you. So that can be one of the things that comes up straight away with the strong Pallas Athena chart. Now, another thing that's really important to look at is how she came about. She was born on the shores of Lake Triton, her mother's sacred place, using a sacred women's ceremonial tool, the double-sided axe, which represented childbirth. And women's genitalia too was actually represented by this axe. So she was kind of associated before this. It's like she's a later version of an older goddess by the name of Neith, that was also born on that lake, the shores of that lake. And Neith was a triple goddess, the maiden, mother, crone type of a goddess. And she was worshipped by the people of that area. This is Libya. There were matriarchal Amazon type tribes that worshipped Neith. And the double-headed axe was important to them. She was a snake goddess. So the idea of, Medusa was also quite strong and present in this particular mythology. So Demetra George talks about Neith in terms of this triple goddess, and the aspects she refers to as like Pallas, Athena and Medusa being the three aspects of that goddess Neith. Now, as the mythology or the stories moved across into Greece, because stories always migrate with the people, or worship or goddesses and religions migrate with the people. As it moved into Greece, it was kind of stripped away of all of its kind of matriarchal origins, and stripped back to Athena. But she did keep that preface to her name. She was still Pallas Athena, and she actually wore the Medusa on her breastplate. I find that really interesting, because to me it's quite telling about this acknowledging her matriarchal roots without necessarily speaking about it. It's this quiet acknowledgement. So she had feminine or matriarchal beginnings, but they were taken away from her by her father Zeus, and there was a level of fear right from the word go that if she were to be too feminine or displease her father in any way, then she may be sort of swallowed down again. So that's kind of her beginnings. Now, as we look at some of the stories that came out about her, and as I said, she was used very much as a little bit of a scapegoat, then some of those stories tell us a little bit about how she was used that way. The first one that I want to talk about is a contest that was going on about who could bring the most useful gift to the Athenian people. Now, Poseidon, he brought a saltwater spring to the people, which was lovely. They loved it. It was beautiful. But then Athena, she brought the olive tree. Now, the olive tree, again, ties her back to those Libyan roots, because that's sort of the origins of the olive tree there. So the people looked at these gifts and decided that Athena's was actually the most useful. The wood could be used for building all sorts of things. The olives are a food, be used for making oils. It was all sorts of useful things about Athena's gift, whereas, Poseidon's was lovely and all, but not as useful. So she wins. Poseidon didn't like this. Poseidon didn't like this at all. And he had a bit of a temper tantrum and flooded the plains and did all sorts of things. Now, eventually, Zeus had to do something about this. And I guess he had two ways of doing this. He could have just enforced that Poseidon needed to just, back off. He lost. Or he could find a way to satisfy Poseidon's injured ego. He didn't like losing to a goddess. And Zeus decided to go with the latter. So what happened was that all the women of Athens were stripped of their citizenship. And without citizenship, they no longer had voting rights. And without voting rights, when the votes were retallied, lo and behold, turns out Poseidon was the winner after all. So, by bettering the god, Athena actually didn't cause, but the result was damaging for the women of Athens. And they lost more than just that too. They were no longer allowed to give their children their name, pass their name on, and all sorts of things. Like all of the rights and privileges that went with being a citizen of Athens was stripped from them. They were no longer considered citizens. Only men could be citizens of Athens. Now, Athena was a master strategist, and she would have learnt from this that though she won the battle, so to speak, she lost the war. So this is another theme that can come up in people's charts when they've got a strong Athena. It can be a fear of winning. Because if I win, what might the results be of that? What if I win and really I end up losing, So they don't necessarily want to win because of that. Women in particular can often come across this in terms of not wanting to show up their male counterparts, particularly in the area of business, because if they damage the male's pride, the consequences could be just like not really have been worth it at all. And I'm speaking very, very generally, of course, because I know that obviously not all men put women in that situations at all. But it's a thing that's kind of systemic. It's something that most women have grown up with. Women are taught to take a second place, whether it's taught to them consciously or unconsciously. We are taught to take a second place. So, that can be, if Pallas is strong in a chart, that can be a theme that comes through, depending on where it's sitting and all of that. So, another time when Pallas was used as a bit of a scapegoat was a trial. There was this trial of this fellow, Orestes. Now, Orestes was a human, not a god. He killed his mother. Now, back in that time and place, it was actually not so bad to kill people, but it was considered a crime to kill a blood relative. You mustn't kill a blood relative. That was a terrible crime. Now, Orestes had killed his mother, and throughout the story there's no question about whether or not he actually killed her. He did. The question comes about as to whether or not this is actually a crime. So he's being hounded by the Furies, and the Furies are these other goddesses, sisters, that basically tormented criminals of all sorts, but particularly criminals that kill a parent. That was their kind of pet hate, I suppose, that they would hound them and drive them practically to the point of madness. So Orestes had fled to Apollo's temple for sanctuary, and it was actually Athena that found him there. So she decides that the best thing to do moving forward here is to just arrange a trial for him. Now, she's probably thinking it's pretty much an open and shut case. He's killed his mother. There's no actual question about whether or not he killed his mother. And his mother is obviously a blood relative. So the trial is set. What happens is the votes end up being tied, which shows you just how much of a hold patriarchy had on this society, that the votes should be tied. Half of the people there actually thought, it's just your mother, that's okay. The other half thought, she's still a blood relative. So they're tied. And Apollo, who is actually defending Orestes, because remember he ran to him for that sanctuary, he's defending him and saying, a mother's not really the parent. She's more like a nursemaid, or someone you might leave a plant with, pot plant to be cared for, that kind of thing. That's more what the mother is. The father is the true parent. And then he turns to Athena and goes, like Athena here. She had no mother. She was never born in a womb. Clearly, a mother and a womb is not necessary, She was born from her father. And then he turns to Athena and says, so, I say we give the casting vote to Athena. She can decide. Talk about being in between a rock and a hard place. She had to have known she was being set up here. Last time she beat a god, look what happened to the women of Athens. If she beats Apollo here, what are the consequences going to be to the women of Athens now? What's the consequences going to be to the goddesses? So she's got to be weighing all this up in her mind. She's not stupid. She's a master strategist. She's got to be weighing all this up in her mind. To me, this is like really straightforward. I just, when you look at these mythologies, and I just can't see how people can't just go, well, did she have a choice? And so she ends up that she votes in favour at that and she says that yes, she votes that men are superior in all things. And then she adds a little clause in there where she goes like, yeah, but I'm not going to marry one. And I just kind of look at that and just go, that's like, going like, yeah, but no, not really. Like, I'm just going along with what you're saying, but no, it's not what I actually think, is kind of what it was there. So really difficult situation. Now, I know a lot of women and feminists look at this particular story and feel that Athena, sold women out, that she just was all for the men. But I don't believe that, I think that given some of the other stories, like the contest with Poseidon and so forth, that Athena was used very much to manipulate situations, and she was just trying to keep things alive, or as best as she could for women and goddesses, given the way things were heading, So in a birth chart, again, what Pallas can represent is people who are unable to, fight for their rights or beliefs in an outright manner, but need to kind of play the long game, that need to kind of just be smart about it. And in my mind, I compare this to more modern times, modern history, to like when we had, the terrible time in history with Nazi occupations in the war, and how many people were trying to fight or protect vulnerable people, the Jewish people, from this situation by hiding them in their homes, and they would have to play the game, basically, in as much as that if ever Nazi officers or whatever were coming through to inspect or look for people, they would have to do the whole Hitler thing and pretend to be loyal to that particular regime, in order to be able to protect the families that right at that moment in time they had hidden under their floors, And I feel that perhaps Athena was a little bit like that in these sorts of situations. It's like she had to play the long game, or else there would be just destruction to the people and the goddesses that she was ultimately trying to protect. So I see her very much as a protector too. And I think people with a strong Pallas Athena in their chart have that element there of wanting to protect as well. So that can be another theme that is seen, not being able to fight outwardly, but trying to protect by playing the long game, that kind of thing. The last story about Pallas Athena that I would like to talk about is, of course, Medusa, because we can't possibly speak of Athena and not speak of a Medusa, because that's probably one of the most common stories in which she's associated with. Now, first things first, her more ancient origins, if you remember, Pallas Athena and Medusa are all kind of tied together as aspects of that ancient goddess Neith. They're all part of the same. They came from the same place, the same origins, the same people, the same tribes. That's where they're from. So Pallas Athena and Medusa are really part of the same. Even if we were to separate them and just ignore those origins and treat Athena as genuinely had just burst out of her father's head with no connection whatsoever to her matriarchal origins, even if we were to just accept that narrative, even in that narrative, we are told that Medusa was a beautiful woman, that she was an Amazon Libyan, princess or queen, in those tribes that lived in that area where Medusa and the Gorgon goddesses, snake goddesses, were worshipped. And part of the worship of a lot of those tribes in that area did incorporate wearing the masks of Gorgons with the snake hair. So this was kind of part of her religion or her belief system, or her, she was already kind of like a priestess of the Gorgon tribes, Medusa, before any of this happened. So what happens in the mythology is that Poseidon, again, sets his eye on Medusa, this beautiful woman. And Medusa just like rejects him and runs, tries to escape. And of course, she runs to Athena's temple for protection, for sanctuary. But Athena's not there at that time. And Poseidon catches up with her and rapes her right there in Athena's temple. Now, when Athena comes, the traditional telling of this story is that she is so angry about this situation, but she doesn't punish Poseidon, she punishes Medusa by turning her into this snake-haired Gorgon that can turn men to stone with a glance. First of all, they're part of the same. Why is she going to punish her? Second ago, even if we ignore that they're part of the same, Medusa was already a Gorgon queen. This is not something unusual. She was already recognised as being this, not in a physical way, but she would have wore these masks ceremonially and things like that. So, whether we're to believe that Athena turned her physically into a Gorgon with real snake hair, or whether this is just, a more symbolic thing of that now this already Gorgon priestess could turn men to stone with a glance. Whichever way we look at it, I'm seeing this as a blessing, not a curse. She's just been raped. Now she has the ability to protect herself, to ensure this never happens to her again, should she choose. And I believe that it was a choice. I don't believe that everyone that ever looked at Medusa was turned to stone. I just believe that she could look at them in a way that would turn them to stone, should she choose to protect herself. So in my eyes, it's a blessing. Anyway. So this is the story of Medusa and how I sort of see it. We're later told that Medusa is killed by Perseus, and that Athena helps him with this. Well, I can't really say much about the mythology as such, but I do find it very difficult to believe that she would be a part of killing something that is a part of her and her origins. But we'll leave that bit at that. The part I do find interesting, however, is that she takes some of the blood from Medusa's severed head. And the reason that she takes some of this blood is for healing the living and regenerating the dead. And again, this speaks to me of regeneration, of biding your time, of waiting. Medusa's not going to ever really be dead because I've saved some of the blood. We can revive this. We can bring this back. That kind of a symbolism is what I see in that. The symbolism that this is something that will not actually ever die. We will keep it safe until it's safe. And I feel like the time is now, with the discovery of these asteroids, which I know was, a couple of hundred years ago. But what we find when any new sort of celestial body is discovered, there's usually some kind of events going on in the world that reflects that, and it becomes a part of the meaning of that planet. We had Uranus was found, and this was around the times of of a couple of pretty major kind of revolutions on our planet, with the American, civil revolution and the French revolutions and things like that were going on at that time. It was a time of freedom fighting, and we now think of Uranus as a bit of a rebellious freedom fighting kind of revolutionary planet. Neptune came along at a time when spirituality and all of those things were quite at a height. We had mediums, spewing ectoplasm all over the place, and stuff like that happening around the time. So that's kind of a bit of a reflection of what some of the meanings that Neptune took on. And Pluto, of course, was discovered at a time when mankind literally found the power to destroy, like the planet, with the atom bomb, that kind of thing happening around the time of the discovery of Pluto. So again, that kind of destructive forces are really pushed into there. Now, what happened with the asteroids is that was a time of where the first wave of feminism began. So this is why I tend to think that almost everything to do with the asteroids relates in some way back to feminist causes. And while we're going off track a little bit here, I'd like to say that it's not that feminist causes are not necessarily just about women, they're about everyone. And when this first wave of feminism began, this was when women decided that they wanted the vote, they wanted to get a voice. It wasn't even a voice for themselves that they even wanted in the first place. Most of this all came about because we were having situations where we were starting to look at, abolishing slavery and things like that. And so there was starting to be public meetings about abolishing slavery and stuff. And a lot of women wanted to go to these meetings and add their voice because they thought, yes, we want to see this abolished too. We don't agree with this. We want this gone. They weren't allowed in. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to speak. They weren't allowed anything to do with it. It was none of their business, basically. And it was kind of from that women went like, you know what? We actually need to get a voice for ourselves before we can add our voices to freedom and liberty for everybody, because that's what they ultimately first wanted, So what happens now is in modern times is that people forget that this is the foundations of feminism. The foundations of feminism is equality for all, not just a male-woman thing. The foundations are about providing the voiceless with a voice. And so we get things like environmentalism that comes very heavily under a feminist style umbrella too, giving a voice to the environment, caring for the environment. We have animal welfare that comes under there, giving a voice to the animals, caring for animals that need care. Any kind of cause where either a person or a thing or whatever is voiceless and is powerless falls under the feminine umbrella. That's what feminism is about. So the asteroids tie in deeply to this, very deeply in various ways. But anyway, that was a bit of an aside. But the point that we were getting to there was that this is the essence of Pallas Athena, is that feminine kind of issues. So where were we up to? These are some of the stronger, more powerful things that can show up in a birth chart, the stuff that we've been speaking about so far. But it's important to also understand that Athena was also just a warrior or a master strategist. She was a goddess of wisdom. So she represents all of those things in a birth chart too. So people that are fighting for a cause, a bit like we just spoke about with the how all the asteroids kind of tie into that. So fighting for a cause is quite, a prominent Pallas Athena might be looking at that kind of thing. Another thing that's interesting is that she was a virgin goddess, in that she kind of denied her sexuality and sensuality. And the reason that she did this is that she wanted to be seen as a peer to the other gods, because the gods were beginning to, by that stage, look at goddesses more as like playthings and insignificant, and she wanted their respect. So she removed all that kind of feminine sort of stuff about herself. So again, this can be something that shows up in a person's chart with a strong Pallas Athena, where they are, quite competitive and present themselves in a masculine way, particularly again in the business world, because they're trying to compete in a man's world. So that can be another thing that we'll see with some strong Pallas Athenas, which is, really unbalanced. And we see it go either way too with this. But the whole thing with Pallas Athena and the asteroids and shining the light on these issues is shining a light on this gender stuff, shining a light on these lists that have been created by a patriarchal society to go, this is what it means to be a woman and this is what it means to be a man, and kind of breaking those boundaries down and going like, gender is kind of like a made up structure. It doesn't really exist. People can have any and all of those attributes in their personality and express them in their lives. And so Pallas Athena is a little bit about breaking down those barriers where, women can present themselves in what might be seen as traditionally masculine, as she chose to, but also that they don't have to, they don't have to present themselves that way in order to get respect. And that men don't have to present themselves in any particular way either in order to get respect. So, it goes both ways. Breaking down those boundaries is important. Over-identification with the father or masculine, as we've sort of said, is that kind of thing, but that can also come from that wanting to please father. So we can get sort of quite a few various complex father issues with some strong Pallas Athenas, where they're trying to prove themselves to their father by either being daddy's little girl or daddy's little tomboy or whatever it is that they think makes their father happy, trying to fit into that role, because Athena kind of had to keep her little role going because that was amusing Zeus. He quite liked having a little mini him in a goddess form. So, it was trying to fit into that. That can be a thing that happens. There can also be a disconnection from your roots, or this sense of homesickness, because remember, Pallas was very much separated from her matriarchal roots. She couldn't speak of her mother, as far as the new mythology was concerned. Mother did not exist. There was no such thing as her mother. So she had to be separated from those roots. So there can be a real longing, almost like a homesickness for something, but you don't even know what it is because you never had it. A separation from something like that. And that can show up in some people's charts as Pallas Athena. She also brought a lot of gifts to the Athenian people. She was, as we said, a goddess of wisdom and strategy. She taught the people how to find peaceful solutions to their conflicts. That was an important thing that she taught them. She taught them about law and justice and so forth. So these are important Pallas Athena themes. Athens was considered the intellectual centre of Greece. So anything to do with knowledge and learning and the intellect is very much a Pallas Athena thing too. She's credited with inventing the flute, the potter's wheel and the plough, and she was considered the patroness of artists and craftspersons of all kinds. So again, we've got that creative kind of artistic stuff that can be tied into Pallas Athena too. Now, at its core, and this is how Demetra George kind of describes it, at its core, it's about the intellect, or how you think, learn and see things, and then what you want to create based on that intellectual perception. So Demetra George calls this the creative mental urge. I tend to think it's all of that, but even more specific. I tend to think that it's that perception, what we learn and think and see of our perception of women and gender in the world. And then what we want to create from that knowledge or understanding. I tend to think it's much more about women's issues than just our general kind of view and perception of the world. So a lot obviously goes into figuring out how this plays out in a personal birth chart, but like any aspect in a chart, the first thing we're going to be looking at is what sign, the asteroid is in, and the house that it's in, and any aspects that it's making. The most important aspects you would be looking for in this kind of thing would be a close hard aspect, in particular, so conjunctions or oppositions or squares to the sun, the moon, or whichever planet is the ascendant ruler. They're the three biggies. But I would also say Venus is an important one in there as a feminine planet too. That would be a good one. But I think any really close contact to any of the planets is obviously going to influence the strength. And if it's on an angle too as well, if it's on an angle, then of course, becomes much more prominent then too. So they're the sorts of aspects you'd be looking at to see how strong or how emphasized this particular aspect is in a birth chart, and along with what its expression would be through the house and the sign that it's in. Of course, being an asteroid, it doesn't rule any of the houses, so there's no rulerships to take into consideration there. But the house and sign is obviously very significant. So I want to quickly just run through what Pallas, what each of the signs, how that particular Pallas energy might be expressed through those signs, just to give you a bit of a feel. And of course, it's just like one way. There's all sorts of ways that mythology could be getting pulled out, and depending on what other planets and things and houses are involved as to how it might be seen. But as a base place to start, I guess, if Pallas Athena was in Aries, then we're kind of seeing that you know, the Pallas Athena that's kind of viewing the world as this place to conquer, you know, the palace that has just kind of burst out of the father's head, ready to fight, and has let out the victory cry. You know, this is the energy that we might expect to see if Pallas Athena is in Aries, and particularly highlighted by some sort of aspect in Aries too. So quite competitive energy, might be competitive in the way of sports, or particularly sports and activities that are if this is a woman, it might be sports and activities that are generally outside of the realm of where women normally would compete. And if not competitive in a physical manner, most certainly competitive in a intellectual manner, because you know, Pallas is all about the intellect and strategy as well. So this could very much be the person that wants to, particularly in women, and I guess we're talking very much about women because these are the ones that tend to be affected by the asteroids more, particularly in women, we're looking at the type of woman that wants to at least match or outmatch her male counterpart. But in a man's chart, we're still going to see that strong competitive kind of nature and imagery too. In Taurus, the energy becomes a little bit more grounded, because we're talking about an earth sign, and a fixed earth sign at that. So Taurus being ruled by Venus, I tend to think that a lot of that artisan stuff might get kind of drawn in a little bit more to this expression. So art and creativity and things like that might be a good expression of that Pallas Athena energy. Doesn't mean you have to be a wonderful artist and good at art by any stretch of the imagination. It's an outlet, you know, and a lot of women might look at, particularly enjoy those feminine kind of themes in art, or the imagery, the goddessy type imagery and that kind of stuff in a real earthy kind of a way. And they might use this as an outlet to sort of voice some of their beliefs about women in society. Gemini is the next one, which is an air sign, of course, and it's a mutable air sign at that. So air signs are always going to be about sort of vocalizing or speaking, communicating their beliefs and ideas. And I sort of think of Gemini as quite a fluidy kind of a sign with flow and movement, and as such, you know, I immediately think of poetry and song and things like that as being a means of perhaps expressing some of these beliefs and ideas about the feminine in the world. And it was interesting because I presented this talk just recently at a little workshop, and I mentioned that I kind of saw this as a bit of a, you know, pen is mightier than the sword kind of a thing, and it made me think very much of like rap battles or poetry slams, that kind of thing. And there was a young woman in the group there that had Pallas Athena in Gemini, and I noticed that she and her friend were having a bit of a giggle, so I kind of asked and said, oh, you know, are you relating to this or what? And she said, yeah, I was at a poetry slam last night. And it kind of blew me away a bit because it was just so literal, the interpretation of it. So now that doesn't mean that because you've got Pallas Athena in Gemini that you are going to always be involved in that sort of thing, but it might be something that you appreciate. And it's certainly when it comes to your beliefs and ideas about women in society, you're not likely one to be quiet about it. So there's Gemini. Now moving on to Cancer. Cancer, we've got cardinal water, which is quite an initiating, a nurturing kind of an energy. And I think this is the sort of energy that we could relate very much to, caring for women, allowing women the space to be nurtured and to be able to express their feelings and ideas about women in society. So women's circles and things like that, nurturing and caring, empowering kind of spaces could be very much a Cancer expression of Pallas Athena. Leo as a sign, it moves through the world with this sense of pride. So there's going to be pride attached to the Pallas Athena in Leo, and attached to all of those Pallas Athena stories and mythologies will have a sense of pride attached to it. So public speaking and kind of being able to take your ideas and thoughts on this matter and impress them onto other people can be a very strong way that Leo can kind of express themselves and gain that sense of pride too. So they can be quite charismatic, and they can be these very good spokespersons for women's issues and other freedom issues, that kind of thing. Because Leo does have that strong sense of pride, this can be a sign that needs to be a little bit wary of falling into that daddy's little girl kind of trap, where they are so worried of disappointing or letting down the father or father type figures, authority figures in their lives, that they kind of bend to become whatever it is that they think they should be in order to gain that recognition and pride. So that's something to be cautious of if you recognize that kind of tendency in yourself. Moving on to Virgo, we've got mutable earth. And Virgos are, of course, if nothing else, perfectionists. They like to do things right. They like to perfect things. So they are likely going to focus on skills and learning skills, or helping other women to learn the skills, being of some sort of service to create like a better place for women, or a better perception of women. I do think, like on a more global, not so much personal point, but on a more global thing, that these are the sorts of things. A Virgo Pallas theme is very much like those various programs that a lot of charities do. Like I think World Vision does one where you can give an X amount of money, and they provide a woman with the education and the tools and everything they need to begin a little micro business, so that kind of changes their own perception of women and themselves in the world, and their abilities and what they can do and achieve. So it's kind of that real physical, teaching and helping kind of thing going on. So that can be the kind of the feel of the Pallas Athena in the Virgo sign, that wanting to do something in a very physical way to make that difference, whether it's in their personal life or whether it's in the field they work in, again depending on how strongly highlighted Pallas is in a birth chart. Some people, for the asteroids, if they're not highlighted by anything, they kind of gloss over and aren't really a significant point. But for other people, they are really very literal and very dramatic in the way that they are expressed. So I think, it's always worth looking at a chart to see whether these asteroids are prominent and significant, because they will add a lot of extra details. But for many of us, they won't. For many of us, or some of them won't, but there might be one of them that like really does. So, you know, but it's worth that look. Libra, cardinal air. So this is, of course, in the signs considered the diplomat, the one that can actually wants to find these peaceful kind of diplomatic solutions. And we see this in the Pallas Athena, that that was the strategist, but she was always teaching her people about law and justice and things like that. So if Pallas Athena is in Libra, that's kind of the feel about how they might want to make a difference for women in the world, or those that need a voice in the world through these diplomatic kind of avenues, changing laws and petitions and working as ambassadors, you know, that kind of thing is the way that they would if they're not doing it themselves, it's the way that they would see is the best way of moving forward to make real change and real differences. Moving into Scorpio, we've got really intense emotions, and this is the domain of Medusa, you know, with that death stare. You know, if someone has, you know, a Scorpio Pallas Athena that is highlighted and you dare to say something misogynistic around that person, and or racist, or, you know, anything that like that, their death stare that you will get, you'll be lucky to survive the stare, let alone whatever's going to come next. You know, they will turn you to stone with that look. Yeah. So one of the tricky parts, I guess, for a strong Pallas Athena in Scorpio is choosing the battles. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that you shouldn't stand up for any form of misogyny or racism that you see. I think you see something, you say something, but also being aware of your own physical safety in any particular situation too. And because they are so quick to go to war, perhaps, you know, trying to strategize a little bit and maybe hold the you know, be careful you don't go to war so strong that you end up losing winning the battle and losing the war, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, because they're so passionate about it that sometimes they need to just take a step back, still say something, still do something, but maybe you don't have to go full war mode at the moment. Yeah. Depends on the situation, obviously, but strong emotional beliefs around women's rights and feminism, or whatever rights it is that is their particular passion. Moving into Sagittarius, the explorer. This is a sort of Pallas Athena that might be more interested in that higher education, looking at the like the mythologies or the histories or the cultural things that have gone into creating this certain situations and systems, and how we can then use that knowledge to kind of deconstruct some of this stuff and make those changes too. It's a fire sign too, so they're much like Aries going to want to push the boundaries a little bit on things. They're going to want to expand and kind of, in the case of women in particular, perhaps venture into areas that are generally not necessarily seen as women's areas. Yeah, challenging the boundaries, very much so. Capricorn's the leader archetype in the zodiac, and so these are often people that are going to take the lead in these types of issues, these types of fights, and particularly with women, these are our very powerful and strong feminine leaders, or that encourage women to become strong leaders. The difficulty can be with this sign too is that they often fall into that thing of trying to compete in a man's world and denying some of their femininity because they just want to make sure they've got the respect of their peers. And as we've spoke before, this can sometimes, not always, because if that's what you're comfortable with, that's what you're comfortable with, but in some cases it can be unbalanced because it's kind of suppressing some of your feminine qualities and attributes to fit into a box that you think you're supposed to be in order to get respect, whereas really we want to break those boxes down because everyone should get respect. But that can be one of those things that's quite strong with the Pallas in Capricorn. In Aquarius, this is the outside of the box kind of thinking. So this is a sign that we really fits in with the activists because their thinking is really fixed because it's a fixed sign, but it's outside of the box quite often. So they make good activists because they're not easily swayed from the cause that they believe in. They're not easily thrown off course. They'll have these radical, new, different ideas, but they'll stick with them and fight for them. Yeah. And this is like, I think of the energy of in the 70s when, all the women were like burning their bra, that kind of thing. That's that kind of Pallas in Aquarius kind of a thing. And often they can appear very rebellious and feminist in that rebellious kind of a way. So they might wear the t-shirts with the various slogans or the badges and things like that. And I think of Athena that wore Medusa right on her breastplate so that it was right there for everyone to see. And it's kind of that kind of an energy going on too with our Aquarian Pallas Athenas. So they will fight for these causes and be quite determined in their desire to make this difference. These are our activists. And the last sign, of course, is Pisces, and this is our mutable water sign. So Pisces is always quite often compared to being like the spiritual kind of a sign within the zodiac, the one that sort of wants to connect on that kind of higher level. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a spiritual level, but it's generally like a deep level, and it's that emotional connection. They want to connect to people on that emotional, meaningful level. So this is often the Pallas Athena that will be involved in women's spirituality or women's groups and women's cultural things to get that close bonding with other people that are believing and feeling the same things that they are believing and feeling, and in this way being able to try and express how they see the world and what they would like to create from all of that. So that's going through the signs and gives you just a real, very basic outline of what Pallas might be in the birth chart. So I hope that was, useful for some of you. You can take a look at your chart and perhaps recast it using whatever software is available to you to see where Pallas Athena falls and how you think that could be manifesting in your life and in your chart. But I do find these asteroids really quite fascinating. So we'll look some more at some of that kind of thing as we go through these podcasts. But as I said, I want to cover a fairly broad idea of different things to do with astrology and different things to do with feminism and spirituality too, and anything that sort of falls into that kind of realm. So Thank you for joining me today. If you have any particular questions or anything that you would like me to talk about on the podcast, please feel free to email me at carol@theastrologyparlour.com. and I'll have a look at doing what I can to help you there. If you're interested in my services, in getting like your chart read, again, if you go over to my website, theastrologyparlour.com, I'm an Australian, so I spell parlour the Australian way, with the U in it, or the British way. The American way drops the U in parlour, but the astrologyparlour.com if you are interested in looking at my course, the Goddess Project course, or having a consultation with me or any of my other services. So, wonderful to present this first podcast to you. I'll look forward to doing the next one, and my aim is to get them out fortnightly, so every 2 weeks. So enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.